across every time zone, covering both hemispheres. It's time for another installment of Authors First on the Artist First Radio Network. We have a great program coming your way. We're very proud to continue to relate that this broadcast is now averaging over 100,000 listeners per episode, some much, much higher than that. And I imagine this program, with all the downloads it will receive in the future, will probably exceed that big time. Looking forward to this interview ever since it was scheduled. Our guest is a truly interesting character. You've seen him on Ancient Aliens. He's written a bunch of books. He speaks about 1 billion languages, and I'm told he's a hell of a golfer. Let's welcome Dr. Ken Jeremiah. Hi, Ken.
Hi, Scott. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's really cool to watch television and see people on TV that we have on the station. In this case, it's been reverse order. Saw you on the Ancient Aliens before this broadcast, and been looking forward to this for a while. Welcome, welcome.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Dr. Ken has written a book called Eternal Remains, World Mummification, and the Beliefs That Make It Necessary. We're going to be covering as much as we can about that in this hour. But first, let's talk about, for those of you who haven't seen Ken on television and didn't know he was a great golfer, we're just going to discuss a little bit about Ken as a human being before we get into all that. So, Ken, tell us a little bit about yourself. Where'd you grow up?
Well, I grew up in Narragansett, Rhode Island, and started playing golf when I was younger, and initially thought maybe I'd make a career out of giving golf lessons. So I became a golf professional, and I teach languages, and I teach comparative religion courses, and really I've always been interested in reading, writing, etc. But if you had asked me or told me years ago that I'd be writing books on mummification, I wouldn't have believed it, because it was kind of a recent development and a very unusual discovery in Japan that kind of led me down this path. Yes,
I can't wait to get into this topic. It is when people hear mummies, I'm sure we think about a person wrapped in cloth walking around with his arms out, like Hollywood portrayed it. But wow, what a deep subject it is that we'll be getting into.
Sure.
So what was it that you've written? By the way, you've written a number of books. They're all on the website. By the way, folks, surf on over to kenjeremiah.com. It's linked on our Artist First homepage. If you're listening to this as an archive, the link is also there, and you can click right on over and see and find out about Dr. Ken and all his writings. So what got you into this particular topic?
Well, it was a strange thing. For years I was doing... I was leading tour groups through Tokyo, Hiroshima, and Kyoto in Japan. And typically, after my work had ended, I was in the Kyoto area, and I loved the Kyoto area, so I'd spend maybe an extra week exploring things there and hanging out in Kyoto. And throughout the years, I had never gotten up into northern Japan much. So my plan was, I think this was in 2003, my plan was, after my work had ended, I'd go back to Tokyo, and then start exploring the northern regions. And I had planned to go through Asahikawa and up to Wakkanai, the most northern town in Hokkaido, Japan's northernmost island, and then take a boat to Siberia. That was the plan. So I headed up to Yamagata Prefecture, Akita, Miyagi Prefecture. I got to Nagano, got to Aomori, then crossed over into Hokkaido, went to Sapporo, and then on a train from Sapporo to Asahikawa, I started speaking with an older gentleman sitting next to me, and he asked what I was doing in Japan, and I explained it to him. So he asked if I had seen the Sokushinbutsu in Yamagata, and we were speaking in Japanese, and I had no idea what this term meant. And I had a little pocket dictionary with me, so I looked it up, and of course it wasn't in there. So I started asking some questions, and he explained that there was this group of individuals in Yamagata that had actually mummified themselves. And when I first heard this, I actually thought I was misunderstanding something, and the longer he explained this, the more it seemed they actually did succeed in self-mummification. So I abandoned my plans. I spent one night in Asahikawa and literally just turned around and went back to Yamagata. And that first year, I visited one body. I visited an individual that they call Shinyokai. His real name was Shindo Nizaiman, and he was born in 1688, died in 1783. And the head priest at the temple explained the process of self-mummification, which is a very bizarre thing. These individuals were called Isegyonin, and that term in Japanese just means someone who is an ascetic for his or her entire life. And these people trained at a place called Seninzawa. And Seninzawa, I translated as Swamp of Wizards or Swamp of Immortals. But the real translation, Senin, means people who are not of this world, often translated as hermits. And Sawa, pronounced Zawa in combination with another word, really means mountain, stream, or swamp. So even the term that I use, the Swamp of Wizards, it's slightly off, but it's the closest we can get in English. But these individuals were trained there. And then they'd embark upon this practice called Mokujiki-gil. And it literally translates to bark eating or tree eating. And it meant abstention from cereals. So they'd cut out grains, they'd cut out cereals, and they'd supplement their diets with these very strange substances like pine needles, pine sap, butter burrs, in some cases small river stones. And over the course of maybe 3,000 days, there's some variance with this depending on the individuals who actually carried out the process. But within about 3,000 days, they gradually reduced the amount that they were eating. And at the end of this time, they'd bury themselves alive, with the help of others, obviously, but they'd bury themselves alive in these boxes that had a small breathing tube. And they'd sit in there and pray and ring a bell. And as soon as the followers heard the bell stop ringing, they assumed the individual had died, sealed the tomb for 3 years, and then they'd dig them up after 3 years. And if they had mummified, they were redressed and then enshrined in these special temple halls called Sokubutsudo. And it was, for me, it was a bizarre thing to hear. So I kind of devoted the next couple of years getting all the books I could on it. There were 2 Japanese texts and 1 Italian text. I translated all of that and then visited the rest of the bodies I could find, talked to individuals in Japan, and then put all that information together in a book called Living Buddhas, which was published in 2005.
That's an amazing account.
Unusual stuff.
It is. Now, I want to go back to the. I mean, somebody. There has to be. I mean, this is a complex procedure that you just described. First of all, it's bizarre as hell. Number one.
Oh yeah.
But number two, do you think these guys were just sitting around one day and goes, "Hey, I got a great idea," and I mean, there had to be something highly motivational to get someone to go through what seems, on the surface, rather horrifying.
Yeah.
What would compel someone to do this? And gee, how did they get the process started?
Yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon. And when we look at the individuals who actually succeeded in doing this, most of them were not religiously oriented early on in life. For example, the first individual I visited, Shinyokai, he was a farmer. And apparently he was walking down the street one day, carrying bags of manure for use on the farm, bumped into a samurai, got some of the manure on him, and the guy drew his sword, intending to cut him down. And Shinyokai defended himself and actually ended up killing this warrior. So he had entered religion to escape from punishment, which at that time was death. A commoner could not kill a samurai. And another individual, probably the most famous of the self-mummified monks, is Tetsumonkai, who died in 1829. He did a similar thing. He apparently fell in love with a prostitute at the pleasure quarters of Yamagata in Tsuruoka. And apparently, we don't know the exact nature of the disagreement, but he ended up in some sort of a fight with 2 samurai over the girl. And one account says that he killed them both with a fire hook. The other account says that he killed them with his bare hand, but he killed these 2 warriors and fled the authorities. And same thing, he entered a Churin temple and started learning about Shingon Buddhism and started learning about a unusual religion called Shugendo. And it's unusual because it's kind of a combination of many different faiths that were put together specifically in northern Japan. And this ended up being adopted within Shingon Buddhism at some point during Japanese history. It looks to be a mistranslation, I think, from Chinese sources that kind of led to this whole thing. And the Chinese had this very unusual practice of pursuing immortality. And it sounds strange, but we have two different types of immortals as far as Chinese literature is concerned. We have one that are individuals who just live very long lives, and they dedicate most of their time to meditation and training and this type of thing. But we also have another type of like legendary immortals. And you see all these stories, and they say, okay, this person actually lived till the age of 100 and then lost his physical form and became an immortal for the next, few centuries, that type of thing. And it's really interesting when you start looking at the Chinese immortality potions and their recipes, they actually contain poisonous substances. And when you really look at the stories of the immortals, you see that they're actually dying. This one individual spent years to create this potion of immortality and decided to test it first on a dog. So he gave this potion to the dog, and the dog dies. And the man named Wei, he decided, well, you know what, I spent my entire life in meditation and learning how to do this. I'm going to take it anyways. So he takes it and dies. His two disciples are sitting there and like, this doesn't make any sense. This was our instructor. He really knew what he was doing. How could he have died? How could the dog have died? So they decided to take it too. And the first one dies, and the last one goes back to get some help. And then when he comes back, he says that all three of them had been basically resurrected. They became immortals, although they left their bodies behind. So in all of these cases, it's clear that these individuals actually killed themselves. They're literally shedding their bodies. And that's why a lot of times you see the Chan masters, the Chinese equivalent of Zen, the Chan masters in China were often compared to cicadas because they shed their husks, they shed their bodies, and continued on. So it's a very strange thing that you have to leave your body in their mentality in order to attain immortality. And when we look at the self-mummified monks, a lot of the practices they actually used were from China. And the mummification itself, I think, developed as a part of the Chinese Taoist diet, where they're eating pine sap, pine resin, etc., and they ended up mummifying. Does that kind of make sense?
I'm not sure. I understand what you're saying. When these guys became immortal, you say they left their physical bodies. Were they able to interact with, I mean, are we talking about people who've had near-death experiences that hovered over their bodies as the medical technicians were trying to revive them? Did they interact with the people in their culture at the time, or did they just go off into the next level of being?
No, I actually think that all of these things, these were